than we typically do on our workshop session, so apologies there. We had some executive session business to handle, but it is 6:22 p.m. We are ready to proceed with our workshop. And the first item is a presentation on effective governance by Kay Love from the Georgia Municipal Association.
Good evening. Greetings from the Georgia Municipal Association. It's exciting to be in the city of College Park with you here. My name's Kay Love, and I serve on the Georgia Municipal Association staff. I serve as a managing director of Georgia City Solutions, which is one of GMA's nonprofits. I have a 25-plus year career in local government. The last place I served was in Roswell for a number of years as their city administrator, and before that, in my hometown of Columbus, Georgia. With me is a colleague, Michael McPherson. He is a member services consultant serving District 3, which is the Metro Atlanta area, so he's a great resource for you. And then unofficially, we have another colleague, Demetrius Calzer, who's on our governmental relations team, so we're excited to be here. And the topics for tonight are there. We're going to have introductions and talk a little bit about effective governance, roles of staff and elected officials, effective communication, and then we'll wrap up. And these are topics that are not new to you. I know that y'all are long-serving public officials, but we might frame it in a different way and give you some things to think about as you look at what effective governance looks like for the city of College Park. And I don't know if you've ever heard of John Nalbandian before, but he is a professor emeritus at the School of Public Affairs for the University of Kansas, but he's also a long-serving former mayor and council member for Lawrence, Kansas, and that's a city of about 100,000 folks. And he is known nationally for his work in research, teaching, training in the area of effective governance. And his definition of effective governance is understanding that what gets accomplished by an organization is that which is politically acceptable and administratively sustainable. And what is politically acceptable is the what, and what is administratively sustainable is the how. In other words, what you can do versus what you want to do, and bridging that gap. And effective governance is all about bridging that gap. When you think about gaps and how you work in gaps every day, and there are a lot of different kinds of gaps. There are knowledge gaps. There are information gaps. There are resource gaps. There are relationship gaps. And the list goes on, and so you're called upon to bridge that gap, and there are elected officials, there are city staff, and then the community that you have to work through. And so how do you do that? With what is politically acceptable, what you want to do, you are setting the vision. You are setting the goals and the priorities and guiding staff and directing them on the things that you expect to get accomplished. You're listening to your constituents and hopefully to each other about particular topics and how you go about doing your business. And your representation many times is in an individual fashion in that you are voting as an individual elected official. However, you govern as a body collectively, and no one individual elected official has the autonomy to affect any one action or policy. It takes consensus or a vote of that whole to make that happen. And sometimes you may not even think of yourself as a member of a team, although you are, because you are elected individually to serve a specific geographic area and to serve your constituents. And sometimes that may cause a gap. As leadership changes and you may have elected officials come and go, sometimes there are information and knowledge gaps that you have to help bring along the new folks and help them learn history and understand what has happened previously in the city. Much like that with staff on the how of how they're getting it done. They're getting the what done by the how, the mechanics, and all of that's based on data and resources, and they rely upon a lot of data and resources and information to give to you as elected officials to make decisions. And staff are hired based on what they know, their experience, their expertise, their education, and you rely upon them to carry out the what. And they have a wide range of background and knowledge, and sometimes that's very different than you. And sometimes there have to be open and frank conversations about where those gaps lie and what needs to happen. And a way to narrow that gap between the what you want to do and the what can be done, how they're going to get it done, is make sure that they have the tools and the resources to do that and be there when they need you to set those guidelines and directives and policies, and then get out of their way and let them get the job done for you in the way that you would want them to do it. If you think about bridging the gap in the context of the city's mission, which the city's mission is to cultivate a community where businesses, families, and individuals can work, play, and live in a safe and diverse environment. This is your purpose. This is your why. And your why drives your what, and the what that you want to do is what drives the how of how staff is going to execute on that. And many times you are called upon to work in that gap. And that gap is noisy, it is chaotic, sometimes it is frustrating, quite frankly, it can be exhausting. Because what happens in that gap in effective governance is all centered on communication. And that is communicating the right information to the right people at the right time and in the right way. And that's an art and not a science, because everybody receives information differently. And sometimes you have to think about, well, what is your role? And the primary role of an elected official is to be a community builder. And that job is not easy, because more and more we are seeing that there is such a lack of civility in our world and our nation. And sometimes you are called upon to referee that in the community building that you do. And so it's really important. And so one of the things related to effective governance is to consider two questions that you may marinate on as you think about your role as a community builder. The first one is, how do I, as an individual, work more effectively as a council member in that gap? What are the things that you bring to the table, your talents and your gifts and your expertise, that can help bridge that gap between elected officials, staff, and the community related to effective governance? And then the second one is, what can I do differently to help the council be more effective? Are there things that you can do to help that? Are there things that you're doing as a governing body that maybe you shouldn't do anymore? And that may look like a lot of different things related to communications, related to agenda items, related to disseminating information, and really looking at that and thinking about that. And then I mentioned that effective governance is centered around communication. And this is one of my favorite quotes. I don't know who it's attributed to other than a U.S. government official. "I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I am not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant." Have you ever felt like that before? And you've communicated something, and in your mind it is so crystal clear that there's no way that anyone could have misunderstood what your position was, what your intent was. And we find out that sometimes it gets misinterpreted, it gets misquoted, and it gets misexecuted. And that impedes your ability to be really effective as a government. So when you think about the definition of effective communication, it may look different for different people, but this is more of a textbook definition of behavior that transmits a meaning, which is the message, from one person, the sender, to another, the receiver, in a way that the message is understood. And that seems pretty simple, right? Should be very easy. However, part of being an effective communicator or effective communication is doing one thing really, really well, and that's listening. And everybody may listen differently because there's a lot of distractions, there's barriers, and there's noise that I mentioned. It's kind of noisy and chaotic sometimes. And so there's a lot of types of information that you're called upon to communicate. So there's the good news, that's always fun. Then there's the bad news, and that's not so fun. Then there's technical information. You think about the work of the governing body as you as elected officials, a lot of the topics on your agenda are technical in nature. And so you're relying upon your professional staff to interpret that or to put it in terms where it's easily understandable for the public as well as for you to make informed decisions. And then there's also sensitive information. And there's sensitive information that you have to manage. And a lot of it centers around the timing of it, of when it's appropriate for information to be transmitted and disseminated and in what form and how much. And you have a requirement to be transparent, and you have open meeting requirements and laws that you must follow. And you have to do all of that in that context. And so it's important to be aware of the form of that communication and its appropriateness, because those barriers impact that. And when you have those barriers to effective communication, then it can cause conflict, it can cause resistance to ideas and moving things forward, and it can also cause low morale and lack of trust. So sometimes we make an assumption that everybody knows as much as we do about a topic. Like, yeah, everybody knows all of those details about that topic, but maybe they don't. Maybe they're not as deeply rooted in that topic as you are. Maybe that's not their number one passion and they haven't spent as much time researching a topic as you have. And then sometimes we assume that people have understood what we've said in the way that we've said it. And that's not always true. So it might be a language barrier. It could be a cultural barrier. It could be a person's experience that shapes the way that they have knowledge and understanding of something, that all those things come into play. And so the way that we choose to communicate something might not be the best way for that person to receive that information. In local government, we have about a gazillion acronyms. Just think off the top of your head all the acronyms that you deal with. And you know them and you can recite them and you know exactly what they mean. But everybody doesn't. It reminds me of an example. There is a transportation acronym and that is used a lot. And when I was in Roswell, I was using it on a transportation project with a citizen who was very upset about a transportation project that was impacting their property. And I took data and information and went out to meet the person talking about it, and I kept using the acronym ADT, which stands for Average Daily Trips. And I could tell the person had shut down, but I kept on, and finally in the middle he said, I don't have any idea how ADT relates to this because that is my security company. So ADT is a security company, but ADT also is a transportation term. So just kind of being aware of that and understanding that sometimes that message is not received in the way that you had hoped that it would. And so sometimes, will you go back to that? Sometimes with those barriers to effective communication, it's what we intend to say, it's what we actually say, it's what we hear, and it's what we remember. Sometimes what we remember is the last thing somebody told us, but that might not be the most important piece of information that we need to take into consideration to whatever conversation that we're having. I had a mayor who used to say to me, I know what I just told you, but tell me what you heard. And I used to get really aggravated because I would tell him what I heard and that would not be what he had said, because I was already processing information and thinking about what we had to do to execute, and sometimes I might miss things. And so the impact of ineffective communication is all these things. It's on the slide. But most importantly, it can lead to organizational inefficiency. And there is not any elected official in the nation, I believe, that intentionally wants their organization to be inefficient. It is a byproduct of all those things happening, and it's the perfect storm. Now, there are always one-offs because we're human, and sometimes things are so time-sensitive and things happen in a rush, in a hurry, and you have no choice, and things happen. But if this is the norm instead of the exception, then that's when it can lead to organizational inefficiency. And so, thinking about communication again in that context of the city's mission, of your why, of what you want to get done, and how it's going to get done, then there's some things that you may consider to narrow that gap, to bridge that gap that you're working within every day. And one of those, obviously, you have to follow open meetings and just being aware of how you're creating, maybe creating a quorum. But the elected officials and staff have to talk and have dialogue, especially as initiatives or projects are bubbling up, and there's a lot of research and information that has to pass and has to be shared, and there's input to be received from a variety of folks, whether that's the public or groups or consultants or whatever. And so the first time you have that conversation shouldn't be when you're ready to vote on it. So figuring out ways to have dialogue and using things like workshops and the tools that you use to get that done. And then not focusing on the how, but focusing on the what. The how is what you have stacked. That's the mechanics of how it's going to get done. You're setting the what in that policy based on your why. And so it's really important to not waste your time on that and let your staff help you do that. And then don't assume that you know the position of your fellow council member. Just because they voted one way on an agenda topic last time does not mean they're going to vote the same way this time. Information may have changed. Circumstances may have changed. Their mindset may have shifted for a variety of reasons. And along that, don't assume that everybody has the same bandwidth that you do. You may have a different level of bandwidth related to the what you want to get done. Another may not. Some folks have full-time jobs, others may not, other interests, serve in different capacities. So just kind of keeping that in mind. And then utilizing those tools, whether it's a workshop, you may utilize rules of decorum for your meeting. I know you have some on your agenda as it relates to speakers, of how that gets managed, but how you manage your meetings and work within that related to how you do business with each other, how you interact with your staff, and how you interact with the public, and setting those clear expectations about what that will look like. You may want to use a consent agenda if you don't already for those routine types of items like approving the minutes of a previous council meeting or certain contracts or agreements. All of those things are opportunities for you to use those tools to make you more efficient. Next slide. Thank you. So social media is a great tool to use, and it can be your greatest friend or your worst enemy, as I'm sure you're very aware. And sometimes as individual elected officials, you may be disseminating information about your particular ward or something, and just bearing in mind about what is the city's protocol related to social media, and not getting out in front of the city's official channels of information. Because you're not a news reporter, but you are a conduit with the public for information, and they are looking to you many times for answers and information, just making sure everybody is on the same page related to the information and how it's disseminated. And then everybody doesn't use social media, so you may be unintentionally disenfranchising a group of folks, because if you're getting input and feedback only from social media, then you may be missing out on some of those things that are really important. And you know, there are no shortage of good ideas. They're not. And many times what you're called upon to do is prioritize and say no to good ideas. You may consider, instead of saying no, saying yes if. So yes if we get the resources. Yes if that aligns with the priorities that have been set. Yes if staff can deliver in the timeline that we're looking for. So many times it's about reshuffling that deck, and nobody is in a better position to reshuffle that deck of priorities once you've set them than your city manager. Many times you may be setting priorities, and everything can't be priority one, although it's important, but every one of them can't, so you have to make those tough decisions and then allow the city manager and staff to work through those. And sometimes if you are looking for something to get done in a quicker or sooner priority than was originally set, you may be unintentionally reprioritizing without even realizing that you're doing that. And so the city manager can be a good tool and help with that. You go to the next slide. And then related to emails, I know you know this, but if you send an email, no matter what email address you send it from, whether it's personal or the city's, the reader of that email is automatically reading it as if it came from you in your official position as an elected official. There's just no way around that. And the words that you use certainly are matter. There's a difference in oversight responsibilities that you have that are extremely important versus directing staff unilaterally, so an individual elected official should not be directing staff to do something, particularly as if it's policy related. There's a way to do that, and that should be going through the city manager, as I mentioned before. And there's an example here, if you'll go to the next slide. And I'm not going to go through it because I know that we're short on time, but basically, in this example, one elected official is asking staff to do something related to getting water in city facilities. Staff goes off, spends some time researching, comes back to the mayor and council, provides the information, and the other elected officials are like, where did that come from and why is staff spending time on that? And that just erodes the relationship not only amongst elected officials but also with staff, and it places staff in a difficult position, and it can cause distrust. So it's just something to be aware of. If you don't have protocols in place, for something, then it's a good idea to consider putting a protocol in place so that it's very clear about how you're going to get your what done. Because staff strive to be really, really responsive. So just thinking about the mechanism that you're using to communicate to them and asking them for information is really, really important. They're there to support you in the what that you want to get done, and they take great pride in doing that. So some things are spelled out related to what duties and responsibilities are in your charter and your code of ordinances. But lean on your staff to help you get things done, and then make them accountable for that. I think for the next one and then the next one after that. Want to touch quickly on about being a good listener. I already mentioned that, but one of the things now, everybody's multitasking. It's just kind of the way that we do business. But in thinking about when you are working in that gap and you are bridging that gap, if you are talking to someone but you are looking at your phone or you're on your laptop or whatever it may be, then you are sending a very clear message that that conversation is not your priority. You also may be missing something in the conversation if you're not listening to that. So it's really important to be present in that, because when you are present in your why and you're clear about your what, that how will happen. And that gap between what is politically acceptable and what is administratively sustainable will shrink and get smaller and smaller. Now, it's never going to go away because there are never enough hours in the day. There are 1,440 minutes, no more, no less. We'll never get any more. And there's always a lot of work to be done. There's always more needs than you have money, but just managing within that. And then I'll just close with this last one. The last slide is a quote, one of my favorites. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Happy to answer any questions. GMA is here as a resource to you and however you might need us, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Appreciate it, Ms. Love. Thank you so much. I wanted to have Ms. Love and GMA here because I know that we had spoken during our retreat about establishing some protocols and moving forward in that regard. Any questions for Ms. Love? Councilman Clay?
This is a really, really important topic. I remember back in industry, we used to say communication is our most important problem. Sort of like GE, the reverse of parody on what GE used to say about their most important product. The one thing that, well, there are a number of issues, but the one thing that I think concerns me most these days is the difficulty in speaking with one voice when we don't all agree. And how do you recommend or suggest that we, even though we disagree on something, we make a decision, we vote on it, and that we go forth and represent the will of the council as opposed to the will of the individual?
And that is a difficult one, particularly depending on the topic, if it's more policy related versus project related. But one of the things that we recommend is in adopting whether you want to call it rules of decorum or rules of conduct, is one in there. And basically it is after the vote, then the communication should be what the will of the council was. It doesn't mean that an individual elected official doesn't have an opinion, and they may not have voted for it. But that issue, that topic, that policy, that project is moving forward because that's what the will of the council decided, and staff is acting on that will. So at the end of the day, they're moving forward to push that project or that policy forward. So sometimes it's important to accept that the will of the council is not your individual will. Now, all that being said, it's important to have that dialogue along so that everybody's making an informed decision. But individual council members should not be, after a vote, should not be out because it undermines your effectiveness as a governing body. Because it's as if, well, the vote didn't matter. Well, the vote did matter because that's the only way that you can do anything. That's the only way anything gets done. You make decisions related to the budget, it's a vote. Any type of policy is a vote, whether it's a resolution or an ordinance. So workshops are a good way to kind of hash that out because there are going to be times when you don't agree. Sometimes, if it's really bad, then is there a way to find out? We know we don't agree, but what do we agree on? Is there one thing so that that end product winds up being the best that it can be? Because sometimes you just got to hold your nose and swallow that pill because it's not always going to be a unanimous vote. But if it is something that is about your why, about your mission, then you voted what you believed as an individual to be in the best interest of the city of College Park. And that's 3 votes. Carries that. And it is difficult, but there should be a protocol about how you're going to disseminate that. And then sometimes, there's those conversations that if it's not working and that continues to happen, that there needs to be a dialogue amongst yourselves.
So a lot of what you said addresses the things that go on before the decision. And I'm focusing more on after the decision and how it is represented. And of course, we're very open in our council meeting. I mean, this meeting is being broadcast and it's being recorded for playback for those who can't watch the live broadcast of it. So people have an opportunity to understand the thinking and the disagreements and maybe even be smarter than we are as to what we're really disagreeing about. They think they're disagreeing about this, but they're really disagreeing about that. So sometimes I think in some ways people who are observing may have a better insight. But I'm thinking about going forward to people that we have to deal with. Developers. We're dealing a lot with developers lately, right? So the council decides one thing, but some individual, perhaps the individual in whose ward the development is going, may say, well, the council decided on this, but between you and me, I'd be perfectly happy if, whatever if is, kind of thing. Or with another governmental entity. Say the airport. Well, the council is saying this, so we've got too much noise from the plane, but I think the planes are just where they have to be, and that's the way it goes, and I'm okay with it. How do you address that?
That's a tough one. It goes to, at the heart of it, it goes to how you operate as a governing body. That there is an element of trust, there is an element of respect, and it is not about stifling an individual's opinion. But after that vote, there should be one accord, like those things really shouldn't be said, but you can't control or legislate what an individual elected official says you can hold each other accountable, but the way you do that is through an agreed upon decorum of this is how we're gonna handle our business, this is what we're gonna do. Because it undermines, like I said before, it undermines the overall effective governance of you as a collective body.
Okay.
But
That's
I don't have a silver bullet for you.
No.
I wish I did.
Yeah, I'll turn it over to next councilman in line, Councilman Carn.
All right. Yeah. Well,
As Mayor Pro Tem,
Mayor
I'm
Pro
calling
Tem.
on Councilman Carnes. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I guess concerns more than questions. I guess I do have a couple of questions, but I piggyback on some of what Ambrose talked about. It is a problem, and I have never seen it like this before up here. How we present ourselves to the community is important, and part of why we were elected is because we want the right presentation in terms of decision making, and every city has an image. Every city has a reputation. You can ask some of our neighboring cities about that. And you want a great reputation. You want to be a place that's welcoming to business and not so argumentative that you run business away. After a decision is made, we've had a lot of issues and wrangling with things that happen. Sometimes a decision is made and a vote is taken, and that directive is not carried out by staff because some elected official instructs staff to delay as much as possible despite a decision being made. These are some of the kind of examples that Ambrose spoke of as well. That has been happening. You're not going to agree on everything. And my opinion is after a vote is taken, hey, you may not agree with the vote. You may be on this side of the vote or that side of the vote, but that's just the way it goes. You win some, you lose some, and this is the will of the body, but you don't go try to subvert that or get to staff to delay it and make sure that it doesn't happen or that it's forgotten about. So I've seen a lot of those type of issues go on and happen. The other thing in terms of communication up here, you got to have an even playing field. And I didn't know you were coming until I saw the agenda, but it's funny, one of my residents sent me an email concerning some of the issues that they had been seeing, and I'll read just a little bit of it. I'm not going to read a whole lot of it, but I think they kind of keenly observed some of the stuff that had been obvious, and it's obvious to a few residents, I think. It says, since the beginning of this year, there have been growing concerns regarding the way our public meetings are being conducted. As a governing body for the city, guidelines and rules must be put in place in order to facilitate a productive meeting. Unfortunately, that is not possible if the guidelines and rules only apply to certain members of the elected body. And whether one admits it or not, we have witnessed the picking and choosing of what rules apply, as well as the creation of brand new rules being dictated based on which elected members are speaking and whether or not someone wants to hear from this person over here, but may not want comments from that person over there. So, and they go on and on and on and on. They're talking about selective rules. It's hard to conduct a meeting when you have one set of rules for certain folks and you have other sets of rules for other folks. So that can lead to a lot of frustration, I imagine, if you're on the wrong end of the wrong set of rules, if you follow what I mean. So if it's one standard for everybody, I guess that's one set of rules that everybody has to play by. But when it's not, obviously, and there are two sets of standards, where one individual can do something and it's perfectly fine, and then another individual does the same thing, and there's a big problem. You got to have one standard. I think that leads to a lot of frustration for folks. Your quote spoke on what's politically acceptable, Now, obviously, that's not going to work politically if you got two sets of political guidelines that you go by. You know, we talk about equity and respect. Those are two of our tenets in terms of our core mission, and they're both very important. But before you have equity, you have to have respect. Well, to get respect, I should say, to get to respect, I think you have to have equity first. Because if it's not equitable, and there are two sets of rules and guidelines, how are you going to get to respect? So you know, we all have different personalities up here. Everybody doesn't speak in the same way. Some people are more temperamental, some people are more emotional, some people are more stressed, some people are less stressed and nonchalant. Some people look at the glass as half empty, some half full. Some people, you know, have a negative bias or outlook. Some people have a more positive outlook. But we represent the diversity of the city at the same time. Before I was on council years ago, and I just got back in January, we had issues and differences, but these meetings were conducted in a way where everyone was still able to get their issues out, while at the same time keeping some sense of decorum. Now, you'd have flare-ups at any meeting, but I think we've gone a little bit, I think a little overboard with it, and I think we need to figure something out. But I think establishing an even set of guidelines for everybody is something that we need to look at. We're videoing these meetings, and it's pretty obvious to a lot of residents that there are two sets of standards. And that's something I think that's got to stop before we can get to the respect part. We need to get to the equity of how we're conducting the meeting. So it's a big issue, and it's something we have to work on internally, like you said, at the end of the day. So, yeah, it's going to take some work.
Yes, sir.
Councilman Allen?
Appreciate you coming out, appreciate your words. I think you hit on a lot of very, very good points. Communications is a big point that we need to communicate. We need to communicate as council, we need to communicate as mayor, as the city, as citizens. We all need to communicate together, and we all need to talk about issues and bring these things up. If you don't bring them up, if you don't talk about them, you can't get results from them. So I think communication is the big issue, and I thank you very much for coming out and speaking with everybody tonight. Thank you.
Councilman Gay?
Ms. Love, I also agree. I appreciate your time this evening coming out. Thank to the good folks at GMA. I think y'all do an amazing job. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kane.
Ms. Love, I had a couple of questions, because you touched on a couple of things that we've discussed, and you were saying that workshop can be a place where we kind of have some of those discussions, those sort of in-depth discussions about some of the issues that might be on the regular session agenda. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you've seen in other communities and how they use workshop. Because usually we're talking about 3 issues at the most and sort of doing presentations, but it sounds like there may be a different approach.
There are, and it can work like that. Some workshops do. It's only topical, and there's not a lot of dialogue and discussion. But what we've seen a lot, and what seems to work, no matter the size of the city, is a more conversational type of workshop or work session where there still may be presentations, but that information is provided in advance. And then there's a time for consensus building around that particular topic, especially as it relates to any type of policy change or project. And many times it may be iterative. It might not be just one workshop. If it's a big item and it has a big impact, or it's something that's new, or if it's a huge project where it's a big expense to the city, then sometimes the workshops are longer. It is difficult sometimes, and there's no perfect way, as you know, you can only allocate so much time before a council meeting, and then you need to move on to the council meeting. So sometimes we have seen cities will have a workshop that is more presentation-based for one of their workshops. And then they'll have another workshop that month that is more of the dialogue conversation, getting everybody all the information they need and having conversations about different aspects of a project or what the impact is or what concerns, or being able to raise those concerns and being heard, because many times if a council member feels like they're needing or having to kind of wait until it's almost time for the vote to ask that question, then it takes up more time in your meeting than it would otherwise. And those meetings obviously are public, and the public can be there and hear that dialogue and conversation. It doesn't mean there's not conversation at the dais when you're getting ready to vote. But we highly recommend those because it is a way to get all of that information out. Many times it may also mean that staff is going back and gathering additional information. And that item may not be, you're not voting yes or no for it. You're voting in there to move it forward to a council agenda, have another workshop or work session, or you may be killing it. You may be deciding that that is not the right project or initiative. It's kind of this yes if, meaning yes if all these things happen, but that's not the priority now. So it does allow you that opportunity to have that dialogue. Some of them do it by topic. Some of them will have one specific for transportation or other, and others have just a hodgepodge of whatever needs to come up.
All right. Well, Councilman Carter,
Well, I agree with you. I've said many times up here, we're a little too restrictive up here in terms of how we conduct this meeting. Sometimes you have to deliberate back and forth unconventionally in a discussion type of a way. A lot of people express themselves in different ways and need to be heard and need to interject and whatnot. I've never had an issue with that. But you can't dictate things in such a way where you can't come to a solution because someone's so frustrated because they're boxed into some kind of rules where we're not able to go back and forth enough to come to the happy medium that we need to come to. I mean, these are important decisions you wrestle and wrangle with. And we need all the latitude as possible to discuss it. And what I was used to was discussing this around until we came to a good solution where there wasn't that feeling of resentment and someone trying to sabotage a decision after the fact, and some of the things that we've been talking around and talking about. So I often say, the most important, one of the most important human needs for anyone is to be heard and allowed to speak, to be heard by the person they're trying to communicate with. That's one of the most important human needs. Anybody that's married certainly knows exactly what it is I'm talking about. But that's restricted a bit up here, and I think that's a big part of the problem that leads to some of the other frustrations, So, yeah, it's something I think, again, we have to work on internally.
One of the things y'all might consider, that dialogue is important, and there's kind of a time and a place for everything. One of the challenges with inside a council meeting is the presiding officer, which in your case happens to be the mayor, is charged with running an efficient meeting, getting the agenda through. There are time limits on public input, so forth and so on. And so that's why workshops or these other avenues and setting in place some meeting rules. So there's certain ways that you have dialogue at a workshop. There's certain ways that you have dialogue at a council meeting. There's certain ways that you have dialogue at a retreat. That you plan and set those priorities. And so having those in place puts those guardrails, and then everybody, for lack of a better way of saying it, knows how to act in whatever situation, because it is important for those opinions to get out there. But then sometimes the meeting becomes inefficient because there's no mechanism to tailor that. And so you have some people who may have the floor longer than they should because you're not moving anything forward. And so it is a balancing act to make sure that you're getting every piece of information you can to deliberate, you're able to deliberate. And so considering, I would highly recommend that y'all consider some type of meeting rules, not something that's strict and restrictive, but these guidelines, so that everybody knows and it's really clear. And so it's not a matter of, because that can be frustrating. I understand what you're saying.
And most councils and commission bodies and school boards, follow Robert's Rules of Orders, like most bodies. I know years ago, we designated a parliamentarian, which was our city attorney. It was Steve Fincher then. And there weren't many times when we had to actually referee something in a serious way, because we did better up here. But yeah, we if we are following those, then those rules sometimes will get tossed out the window sometimes, and couldn't be a good thing. I've seen it many times up here.
I think we've got an opportunity now to move forward. If I'm hearing, is there consensus that we move forward on working on rules of decorum up here?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
You sure?
Absolutely. Great. So I think we can probably get that, move forward and talk about that at the next workshop session about what that looks like. And perhaps I think you've got some examples.
We do. We have several examples we can provide, and y'all can pick the best of the best and tailor it to what works for the city of College Park, because that's what the other cities have done. Looked at what other cities do and tailored it to fit what their needs are.
Let me ask you this. In my opinion, I think the best setting for stuff like that is during a retreat. Now, we had a retreat earlier this year, and at some point we were going to schedule some type of a follow-up retreat of some sort or another. Is that something that maybe GMA could help us facilitate, where it would still be technically a public meeting, but I think a lot of the times it's a little hard to get all your issues out, I guess, with the cameras and the whole nine. So
GMA does facilitate retreats, yes, sir.
Well, we did talk about a follow-up retreat of some sort, so that may be a better setting if we want to actually get to some real solutions. And we made some good progress at the other one, but again, it was still a little structured to the point where maybe everyone couldn't get everything they needed to get off their chest, maybe. I don't know, but I think that's probably the best setting for us to do it in.
So what's the preference of the body? Do we continue the rules of decorum conversation at the next workshop? Do we wait for another retreat? What's the consensus?
Well, I think it might be useful to continue it. I agree with Councilman Carn. We did talk about a second retreat, and I think some of that kind of discussion, you need a more open-ended time frame than the constraints of a workshop. But I think it's still useful, probably in perhaps the next workshop, to have some more discussion so we can firm up what we would like to do in a retreat.
Set up the parameters.
Yeah, the kinds of things we want to cover in the retreat, and where are the sticking points? Because I'm not going to say it now, but I could roll off the top of my head several things that you're trying to do two things at the same time, and you have to balance between the two, and how do we achieve that in an orderly manner?
And I think sometimes you don't tackle a lot of topics because you minimize a lot of the different things that you really need to focus on. So I think you need to home in and focus on certain things and have meetings particularly towards that,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Okay, so I'm not sure what I heard.
I think
So
what we need to do
I want to make sure that
is,
I want to make sure that what we've heard
like
is.
Ambrose suggested.
Wait, hold on. Let me ask my question. Are we going to continue the rules of decorum discussion at the next workshop
I
session?
think that's a good idea.
Okay.
And that next discussion needs to set up the parameters for the retreat.
They very well will lead to an outline for some of the things that we need to cover in a retreat. But it would focus, I think what we're trying to do is say we need to focus on our effectiveness and efficiency as a council. And that can continue in the discussion in the workshop, but probably is going to have to take more discussion and therapy in a follow-up retreat.
And I thought that when we were when we were at our retreat, we had discussed having another one after we had a permanent city manager. And so
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I
I
mentioned.
think that was the,
And I think that might be after the first of the year before we would want to do that. There's a lot of pressing items that we need to address before the first of the year, too.
sure, absolutely. But
Good time.
we'll make sure to get it on we'll make sure to continue the conversation. But Ms. Love, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. The second item on the agenda is a discussion of issues related to housing from Mr. Kyle Wingfield from the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. Mr. Wingfield, thank you for your patience. Appreciate having you here this evening. Mr. Wingfield actually presented to I think it was the Board of Directors of the Georgia Municipal Association back in September, and he and John Hunt, who will be here on November 21st, had some observations on housing that I thought it would be really important for the entire council to hear. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mayor Motley Broom. It's certainly my pleasure to be here. My name is Kyle Wingfield. I'm the president and CEO of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. Really appreciate this invitation to come and speak about this issue, and I'm looking forward to getting to share some information with you that we have developed and get your feedback and answer any questions that you may have. Just very briefly, I want to tell you a little bit about who we are as an organization, how we're working on the issue of housing affordability and what we found, and then most importantly, how we as an organization and the City of College Park could potentially work together to try to find some answers to this problem that's facing pretty much every community in the state of Georgia. So who are we? We are a trusted independent resource for elected officials like yourselves as well as voters. We propose actionable solutions to real life problems, and we do that by bringing people together. We're a think tank based here in Atlanta. We focus on issues related to Georgia, not federal issues or anything like that. We stick only to issues of an economic nature, so we don't work on any social issues or anything like that. We've been around since 1991. A couple of our core principles are belief in free enterprise and limited government, but we're a nonprofit organization, we're nonpartisan, and we're apolitical. We basically look for problems that face the people of Georgia, and we try to find the facts about those, research, produce data, and then try to find answers to those problems. And you can see here, we work on a number of different issues: education, healthcare, transportation, taxes, and then housing affordability is something that we have started very recently. So we started preparing to work on this a few years ago. There was a State House Rural Development Council back in 2018 that looked at this issue, and it became very clear that this is not just a Metro Atlanta problem. This is a problem of statewide importance. And then a year later, there was a House Study Committee on Workforce Housing, and they identified 4 L's that are key to this issue: labor, land, lumber, and laws. And as a think tank, a public policy organization, laws were the ones that the one that we thought that we would make the most impact on. I would say that this year, with the way interest rates have been going and mortgage rates, that we may have to add a 5th L pretty soon, and that would be lending, but that's very preliminary. So the main point that I want to make here today is that our housing affordability problem, and this is not just a Metro Atlanta thing, it's not just a Georgia thing, it's a nationwide thing. This is a problem of supply. We simply have not been building enough homes, and that has resulted in a shortage and therefore higher prices than certainly the people who are looking to buy a home would like to pay. If you can see from this graphic, we built more than twice as many homes in the state of Georgia from 2000 to 2009 than we did from 2010 to 2019. In fact, the number that we built from 2010 to 2019 is about equal to how many we built just in the last half of the 1990s. Well, from the 1990s until 2020, we added more than 2 million people in this state. So there was an estimate really by a U.S. Senate committee that estimated that in Georgia, we probably have a shortage of somewhere over 350,000 homes, that we ought to have that many more than we do. So why is that the issue? Now, obviously, you look at the change from around 2010 into the 2010s. There were a lot of business conditions. We had the Great Recession. A lot of builders went out of business. But this has been a problem beyond just that. So we as an organization wanted to look at what are the causes of this. And so we looked around at issues that were already being discussed in the way of housing affordability, and then things that weren't being discussed as much. There are a lot of governments across the state trying to deal with this question, but one of the questions that we wanted to ask first was, well, are governments potentially making this problem worse before they do anything to try to solve it? So we came across a national study that the National Association of Home Builders does about every 5 years, where they survey builders across the country to determine how much do the various types of regulation, these are local, state, and federal, how much do those cost in terms of the price of a new single-family home? They came out with an edition just in May of last year that looked earlier in the spring of that year. And so in October of last year, we set out to replicate that study on a state level. When we called someone, the economist who does this study for the National Association, he said, well, you know, that'd be great if you want to try that. If you can get the data, give me a call. I'll help you analyze it. But I got to tell you, there's been 100 people who have called me saying they want to do this, and nobody's done it yet. So I think he had some bit of surprise when we called him back and we said, well, we've got the data and we're ready to do this for Georgia. So we published this in January of 2022, and this was based on a survey directed to members of the Home Builders Association of Georgia, and we had a total of about 86 builders or lot developers who provided complete and usable responses. So if you go to this graph, you can see that the total cost of regulation in the price of a single-family home on a national average is a little less than 24%. Here in the state of Georgia, our average is actually higher than that, almost 27%. I get a lot of people who are surprised when they hear that because they think, well, we're a very business-friendly state. We're relatively low regulation. And what I think I would say to that is, this is an issue. First of all, I should preface this by saying we are not in any way arguing that the right answer here is zero. We understand that there are reasons for some regulations, that there are costs involved in complying with those, that sometimes these are incorporating services that a city or a county may provide, and that it's fitting that the homeowner or builder would foot the bill for that rather than the taxpayer who would end up subsidizing that service if they weren't paying that. So we're not saying the right answer is zero. But it is a little eye-opening, I think, that our average is higher here in Georgia than it is nationally. And how did it get that way? I can't say for sure how it's gotten that way, but what we suspect is that it's a lot of little individual items that each over time have built up a little bit at a time. And you're going to see in the coming slides that there's no single item that's 10, 15, 20%. It's lots of little items that each individual one you say, well, maybe this is not a problem, or if it goes from 1.3% to 1.5%, that's not a big deal, to the extent people are even aware of the cost of the regulations they're imposing. But it's added up little by little over time. So you can see there that we measured the regulation during construction and during development. Both of those, the state average is higher than the national average, construction being higher than development. So the next chart is showing the cost during lot development. Again, this is a total of about 11.3% of the home price, and I can tell it's not reading exactly clear up there on the screen. But we have various things here, including the hard costs of compliance, about 3.3%, land dedicated to the government, standards beyond the ordinary, cost of applying for zoning approval, and the pure cost of delay. We can also look at the costs during construction. You can see here, this is where we get to the largest single item, 7%, which is related to changes to building codes over the last 10 years. We only looked over the last 10 years because we didn't want to be incorporating things that have been included for health and safety reasons traditionally, on and on and on. These are only new things that have been added to the code. And then the second highest item that you see as a single item is architectural design standards beyond the ordinary. This is something that actually there was probably the largest gap between how often builders in Georgia face a certain type of regulation versus builders nationally. Builders in Georgia are much more likely to face an architectural design ordinance, meaning things like the percentage of the facade that has to be covered in windows, or the number of roof pitches. But these are things that are not really related to health or safety. They're aesthetic in nature. So the key takeaways here, first of all, this is real money. If you take a $400,000 house, then you're talking about more than $100,000 in regulatory costs toward that house. Again, the little things add up. Just getting down to the national average would save homeowners a lot of money, but I think another illustration that's very important. If the state of Georgia on average were as far below the national average as we are above it, so about 3 percentage points. If we were 3 percentage points below the national average, then on that $400,000 house at prevailing mortgage rates, you'd be talking about saving more than $100 per month on a mortgage. So that's real money for a home buyer. That's the difference between being able to buy a house and not being able to buy a house in a lot of cases. And again, we mentioned that the two largest costs, building code changes and architectural standards, those are within local government's ability to change. So this was the first study we've done on this topic. The second one was published just last week, I think. It was either last week or the week before. This is on development impact fees across the state of Georgia. The city of College Park does not have any of those. There are a lot of cities in North Fulton that do. There are counties north and south of town that have those. There are several of those impact fees in Fayette County and Henry County here on the south side. But that was just published. We're going to have a second part, hopefully by the end of the year, that will be looking at transparency around the revenues from those fees, how those monies are spent. But the one that I really want to call to your attention here is the cost of regulation in multifamily housing. The numbers that I've shared with you already tonight were for single-family homes. We understand that there are different regulations for multifamily housing, and when you talk about affordable housing, oftentimes that's the type of housing that you're looking at, being multifamily. So we have that survey in the field right now. We need a few more responses before we'll be ready to take that, collate the data, and then we're looking to report that out in January. We are also going to be looking next year at minimum lot sizes and home sizes across the state, and then we'll have a fully fledged, robust policy platform by the end of next year. So how can we help? This is really an issue unlike a lot of the ones that we have worked on over the years, because while there are federal regulations, state regulations, and local regulations, a lot of the difference or the variation is at the local regulatory level. So we haven't done a lot of work working directly with local governments before on issues like education or taxation, that sort of thing. But we recognize that that's probably where the needle can be moved the most sharply, is at the local level. So we're looking for local governments that want to try to do something about this, and we would love to have a partnership with you to help work with builders in your area, identifying where maybe, these were statewide averages we were talking about, where maybe some specific challenges may be for a particular community, and try to identify those. We do believe in local control. We also believe in private property rights. We think there's probably no more local form of local control than private property rights. There's been a lot of discussion in Georgia over the last few years about state preemptions of some of these types of activities, particularly with regard to architectural ordinances. I think what we would say about that is it is really tough to strike that balance between private property rights and local control on a statewide basis. That's a really blunt instrument to try to use. And it may be that you know, the legislature in its wisdom will decide that that is what it needs to do. But we would like to see local communities try to take this up on their own and strike that balance for themselves, because we believe that will better reflect what citizens would like. And then finally, you've got my contact information here. Again, we would love to work with you if that is something you'd be interested in, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wingfield. Councilman Clay?
Wow, a whole bunch of things come to mind. I'll try to keep it brief. We are about, I think, 75% rental. A number we throw around. It may be 67, it may be 80, whatever. It's in the ballpark. Large percentage rental. One of the things I worry about is that we don't have the ability to build wealth because people can't afford to buy their own home. We don't have resident ownership of the home. So we've got, I think, a different problem to some degree in that we need to get more home ownership in the city. And I worry about the trend of REITs creating whole developments that are incoming producer for some hedge fund or what have you, and are not benefiting the city, the citizens in wealth development. Having said all that, I think that we can and do need to address simpler, consistent, clear building standards, code inspections, what have you. And yeah, personally, I would welcome that, but it has to be within the context of, I think, building home ownership in all ways. I'm not trying to improve the building standards so that hedge funds can build a less expensive home that we can't build local wealth on ownership.
I understand your points completely, and certainly traditionally in this country, home ownership has been a wealth building mechanism, and we fully support that. I would say that I think my family, like a lot of families, rented before we could buy, and one of the issues that we see right now is that rents have grown to the point where they are competitive, or sometimes even worse than a mortgage might be for a similarly situated family. What I would say in terms of the build-to-rent type communities that we see is, if you go back to that figure about we're 350-something thousand units as a state short, we're kind of in an all of the above posture. I would say that we need more units that may be rental units. We need more units that people would be able to buy, and our position very broadly would be that if we can address the supply problem, we're going to address a lot of those other problems, but we're not going to address those problems without addressing supply. So we would be for more supply in whatever form it takes, but certainly we share that ultimate goal of more people and more families being able to be homeowners.
No, thank you. And I should have said REIT instead of hedge fund, by the way.
Councilman Carr?
Thank you for coming out, Mr. Wingfield. I got to tell you something. I am a huge fan of yours. Friday Facts. I first heard about you guys when my first campaign that I worked on was Vice President Al Gore's in '99, and I started getting your stuff, and the way it's organized, and it's just so, to the point and factual. And, your quotes of note, that's amazing stuff. And I always wonder, who is this person that does it? Honestly, I didn't know if you were a man or a woman because, the name. So I said to myself, well, but it's great to finally actually meet you. And I thought I've met just about everybody throughout this state, but man, I'm a fan. So it's glad to see you finally come in here. I mean, I got them get them on my phone every Friday.
I'm going to have to record that and use that as our promotional material.
No,
everywhere,
you
but
guys need to subscribe to this thing. It's
GeorgiaPolicy.org.
really,
You can subscribe to our Friday Facts email.
Yeah, I think our big issue with housing, I don't want to have regulations so strict that it prevents people from obtaining housing here. Now, I represent the residents, while at the same time, residents have to have good and affordable housing. And if we're doing anything to impede it with over-regulating or too much red tape, now, obviously, I want enough red tape where things are safe and things are within guidelines, and you have some structure and conformity in neighborhoods where anybody can't just throw anything up. But I see the issue in Georgia. It's really, honestly, I believe, and a lot of people think it's an ongoing, I guess, conspiracy or efforts just to restrict home ownership, ultimately to only the wealthy in terms of new home ownership, and the rental rates, for rental. I mean, they're sky high, but I think that's in part to ensure almost the impossibility of home ownership in the future. And I mean, if you look at the big pieces of the puzzle, and I hope that's not going to be the case, I can tell you this, I don't want it to be the case in the city of College Park, because you can't build generational wealth unless you can afford to stay in your home or afford to buy a home in the first place. So that's the cornerstone of a community. We are 75% rental according to the U.S. Census. So we do need more housing stock, but we need affordable housing where people aren't gouged, so much where they have to decide between paying the mortgage or eating, or paying the mortgage and medicine. So yeah, it's going to take a lot of work, but I'm glad you guys are studying this, and I'd love to get a contact on you before you leave. If the clerk, can you get some information on him?
Yes.
Well, I want the bat phone. I want to talk to you. So,
I'll get it to you.
all right.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would attribute this to the person who said it, if I could remember who said it, but the saying is that there's no larger political divide in America than between those who already have their home and those who don't. It's not left, right. It's not, north, south, east, west, however you might put it, but that's the dividing line. And certainly, as we make housing more affordable, we're going to ease that. But there's some tensions between those two groups about what ought to be done, and whether that's going to make things more affordable or whether that's even desirable. I think in some communities is one of the debates that people need to have more out in the open.
Councilman Allen?
I'll keep it kind of short due to time, but I look forward to your multi-family report. There's a definite shortage of houses. I wonder, is there on apartments, are there in multifamily, are there shortages that you know of, or what are the numbers there?
I don't know how the shortage is broken down by type of home. You hear a lot of talk about something called the missing middle, and we're talking about something between a single-family detached home and a large apartment complex. So a duplex, a triplex, something like that, or even some smaller apartment developments.
Okay.
But I don't have a breakdown in terms of the shortage.
I think we need a lot more affordable homes. People are getting caught in the middle. You cannot afford a house. The costs are sky high. They're going higher. So you're in a rental unit, or you're in an apartment or multifamily, and all of a sudden the rent goes up, and then it goes up again, and then it goes up again, and now your rent is about the same as you would be paying for a mortgage. So I think people are getting caught in the middle, so I'd like to learn more about your reports, and again, thank you very much for coming.
We'll certainly make sure you get a copy of the multifamily
Thank
report
you.
when it's finished. Yes, sir.
Councilman Gay?
Well, we're fortunate to have about 400 units, which about 65 already out of the ground. The Rockland Home. What I would be interested in is learning more about how other agencies can help us have a pathway to home ownership. We see that our apartment dwellers can demonstrate the earnings for loans and can pay the rents, but then there's some other mitigating factors. So finding things like how we can find agencies to pay down interest rates, things of that would be helpful for us. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for being here, Mr. Wingfield. Appreciate the time, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
And I'll write down the bat phone here for Councilman Carney.
We will take a brief break here, and we'll resume at 7:45 to give everybody a little bit of breathing space.